Well, thank you so much for having me here today. Really appreciate it. Yeah, I'm going to be talking about effective security on a tight budget. I'm Felix Matenaar, the head of product security at Asana. There's a little QR code here, or actually a huge QR code on the slides for my LinkedIn. If you missed to pull your phone out on the last slide, it will be there again. Okay, before we start, a quick disclaimer. The views and opinions expressed in this presentation are those of mine, and they do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of my current or former or future employers. All right, let's start with a problem statement here. If you've been around security conferences or CISO dinners or general expert conversations, like there's all this talk about perceived tight budget in the industry. Like we almost never have enough budget to get things done. There's so many things we need to get done, and it's just always been difficult for us in the industry. More recently, unless you have been living under a rock, you've probably seen there's a tech downturn, and it amplifies this problem throughout the last 2 years. If that's not already enough, we're also seeing regulation pushing for more security. So recent examples are like privacy regulations. Now there's AI coming, has some security implications, but also if you heard about the SolarWinds story, for example, there's more push towards transparency, and one can argue it helps us as security practitioners to be more empowered to do security, but it also adds to the liability and the pressure. So put all that together, and we kind of having a resource problem, and I want to talk about that today. And the major questions I want to go after today is, number one, and this is a little bit spicy, but I want to say some of this, I believe, is self-inflicted pain. And I'm going to talk about that part, which is how to assess security organizations' effectiveness and prioritization. The other part, however, is how do we effectively influence our funding and get more budget or make more out of the budget that we have? That's going to be the second part. So number one is talking about how we can rearrange our resources potentially to be more effective at our work. And number two is how can we maybe offload more of the work that we're doing today to our organizations, or how can we get organizations that help us get more funding for our security organization? And so for the first question, the mental model that I want to present here is what I call the pyramid of security needs. And it's very similar to the Maslow model of human needs. Basically, if you know, probably most of you know the Maslow model, right? It's human needs, it's on the basis, you have health and shelter and all the food and all these needs, and then go all the way up to self-actualization. And one of the core ideas of the model is you cannot achieve self-actualization at the top unless you have achieved everything below. And I think there's a similarity here to security, is that if you don't achieve some basic security and security coverage, even if you mature, if you try to mature further into more specialized programs, they actually don't give you a lot of value, and we'll be talking about that. So I'm going to be presenting an abstract security maturity model here that you can use to assess where's your current security program at and where does it need to be. And based on that, you can make those resourcing decisions. At the bottom, there's the idea of the first level of maturity is adhere to applicable law, compliance, and regulation. The objective here is basically don't get sued, right? Or based on law and regulation, it's a pretty trivial case for your budget isn't enough, right? If it's not funded, so we're not going to talk about that a lot. But obviously, those are must-have areas to stay on top of and cover. Obviously, they change based on the type of business and your operating and customer location. Once you achieve that, you can move on to the next level. That's where you establish security fundamentals and hygiene. The objective here is I call don't get hacked in a stupid way. And it still sounds very, very basic, but if you think about most of the breaches that happen in the industry today, most of the stories that we hear, we can root cause them to some sort of inconsistency or lack of coverage on security fundamentals, right? Whether it's an account that didn't have 2FA, or whether it was an unpatched system or an employee that wasn't trained properly, a lot of these simple fundamentals and hygienes that can get us hacked. So the objective here is don't get hacked in a stupid way. And yeah, it sounds easy, but I believe that in order to achieve this, you truly need to be consistent and investing in your coverage, right? So like, it's not enough just to say we have a program that patches your system. The question is, are you patching all your systems? And only if you do that, have the coverage across all the organizations you support, you can achieve this type of maturity. Once you achieve that level of maturity, you can start to deeply understand your security posture. So the objective here is beyond your initial hygiene and fundamentals, which is mostly like a checkbox style, type of program building up. Now you actually understand your individual weak spots and what you can defend against with the controls that you have today. Some examples here is like threat modeling, having a risk register, maybe doing fuzzing, bug bounty, all of this gives you like some good data. The question is like how to approach getting to that level of maturity. I think it's very important here to start thinking about declaring what you are and aren't protecting against. So like for establishing security fundamentals and hygiene, I personally believe this is sort of a no-brainer, like almost every serious organization should try to achieve that level of maturity. Here it starts becoming a little more of a question of like what your individual needs are, and I would encourage you for your own organization to think about what do you really need and how far do you need to go to protect whatever you're protecting. And also, like, if you go after this, go breadth first search. I'm seeing a lot of security programs that start threat modeling, for example, and they go down a rabbit hole, and they're missing significant alternative opportunities. Now, if you actually go all the way down and you achieve this level of maturity, you're gonna start working on establishing security resilience. So here, the previous maturity level is really important because how are you going to identify those critical opportunities if you don't have a good mental model of what your weak spots are, right? And so the objective here is to keep motivated attackers at bay. So those examples are zero trust, assume breach, security in depth, etc. How can you approach this? I have the belief that the first question here really is like, do you have the funding in your organization to truly achieve this, and are you realistic about your assessment? I believe in a lot of cases, you can argue this may be covered by insurance actually. And I know as security practitioners, this may not be a very popular belief, but if the trade-off is that you are going to work on security resilience without having proper coverage on your hygiene and fundamentals, one can argue that the ROI of your program is at this point almost zero, because what can get you hacked is that lack of coverage that you're potentially not investing in enough, right? So it's always a question of opportunity cost investing. Like, do you have the means to invest into security resilience without actually sacrificing on those lower maturity levels? Few organizations will ever get there, but if you do, it's very exciting. Testing novel attacks against your systems, kind of the pinnacle of what you can achieve in your security organization. The objective here is to keep sophisticated attackers at bay. So there's obviously a strong dependency on security resilience, otherwise sophisticated attackers are going to easily breach you. But examples here, 0 days assumption and third party, which leads you to stronger isolation and compartmentalization needs. Maybe you want to assume some sort of broken crypto in your most critical systems and see how you mitigate that. You may assume like chain of exploits and techniques are going to be run against you. If you actually go for this, again, ask yourself the question, do you need funding? I would say for most organizations here, the answer is you probably don't need this level of security. Again, can you cover this by insurance? I think it's a very important question that every security practitioner should ask themselves. If you do try to execute, you require unique talent, you may want to contract out. Again, very difficult to actually achieve. Let's go through an example of like what this actually means in practice, right? And so like I work in product security, so AppSec was kind of the closest example here. So what I'm showing here is like different programs that are actually categorized by the level of maturity that they intend to achieve. I'm not arguing like you need to like go through these one by one, but before you invest in a program, what I'm arguing is like ask yourself the question whether you truly achieve the maturity or you go about to achieve the maturity you need on those programs on a lower maturity level, right? So like for example, how much is the best bug bounty program good if you don't have effective vulnerability management and you actually can't get those vulnerabilities remediated? You can still argue this importance here in the visibility, but you need those foundational programs in order to be effective. All right, so summary so far here. In terms of the resourcing, we went through the pyramid of security needs. So there's this idea that you have multiple layers of maturity that you can achieve, and it's really important for you as a security practitioner to ask yourself how far you want to go and how far your funding reaches, and make a realistic assessment about that. Especially problematic is like when the ground is shifting, like merger and acquisition, for example. Maybe you had really good patching 3 years ago, but there's been 2 new acquisitions, and now you're not covering that area anymore. Your funding should consistently cover for these cases, and I would recommend you adjust your funding if you have events like this. Assume your own blind spots. And yeah, beyond hygiene and fundamentals, my belief is that security need truly is a decision. It's not an automatic, yes, of course we need to go beyond. Because if you don't get the funding, what you're effectively doing is you're trading the excitement for a program that is that you're actually not funded for, and you're trading against potential fundamentals and hygiene that ultimately will get you hacked. Also, I want to say, don't forget to have fun. I mean, as security practitioners, we want to learn, we want to experiment, we want to build exploits sometimes, but we need to remain realistic about what makes an impact and what is play. And oftentimes, play does lead to learning, and learning does lead to more effective programs, but we just need to be aware in what buckets we're spending our time. All right, so this is the first part. I was talking about opportunities for security practitioners to think about how to rearrange their resources and investments in order to be more effective at the level of security that they decide to go at. Now we're going to be talking a little bit about how to fund programs smarter. And I'm going to provide 4 examples here. One is sort of like a cultural thing that I like to push for, and it's definitely not easy to execute, but if you can get there, it's actually a huge time saver and enables focus of your security organization. So the core idea here is basically whoever owns, maintains, builds, operates, or otherwise is responsible for a system is implicitly responsible for all security unless the security organization provides explicit support. So the opposite of this is if you hear the CEO saying, hey, we have our CISO because that's great because our CISO is going to make sure we are secure, right? That's all the responsibilities on the CISO and their organization. And as a result, whatever that scope is, which is really difficult to assess, is on the existing funding. And with that, I think that's a very problematic stance. And if you're able to turn this around in your organizational culture, you're able to build a charter for your security organization and say, this is exactly what we're protecting, and nobody else should assume that we're taking responsibility for something that's outside of that charter. And you can emphasize that message. And interestingly, what tends to happen then over time, if you're successful at building this culture, is that teams will come to you to ask whether you can take more responsibility. And that's a decision point where you can ask for funding and say, okay, I can take responsibility for those systems. I can make patching easier for you, but I need funding for this. I'm not going to just go straight into my management chain. I'm going to talk to my partner and say, if I can give you this, but you need to at least advocate or maybe even move over funding to my organization, right? Some examples here include fixing vulnerabilities, patching third-party software, incidents. If you have a good incident response plan, you may be able to shift some of the work to the developers. All right, the second one is, and vendors are going to love me for this. I call this build if and only if you can't buy. There's a lot of build versus buy conversation. My stance here is basically I've observed security organizations build way too much stuff themselves. And I don't believe there's a lot of opportunity here. Was it a vendor? Security, I mean, it's kind of inherent, right? Security engineers, when we're creative people, we want to invent, we want to build new stuff. It's very understandable, but it just is a conflict with our organizational goals in many cases, right? Even me as a manager, I want to hire, right? So yeah, let's build stuff, let's hire more people. Great, that's an incentive for me, but it's wrong in many ways because it creates issues, right? And once you went down the path, you have the sunk cost fallacy, right? So, I'm sure many of you know these cases where organizations have built big systems and then later on they find out there's a vendor that can do this, and then try to get the vendor in. It's often very difficult because there's a lot of, kind of personal opinions about this. So how to avoid this, right? Like, there's different things you can do to facilitate the culture of build only if and only if you can buy. Ask finance to make headcount and vendor budget fungible, I think is the most effective thing you can do here to enable managers to think about how to, do I want to hire or do I want the budget to go with a vendor, like have that flexibility? Because oftentimes that's only set at annual planning time, and then later down the road you actually discover a really helpful vendor, but then maybe your buckets down the line. The other aspect here is like set individual examples and incentives. Like vendor evaluation and integration should be the standard path to become a senior security engineer, or even a staff security engineer, depending on what is the scope of the problem that you're solving. Right? And I think that's the other important aspect here that translates into incentives for managers, is that managers in a security organization should be promoted and compensated by the impact and the scope that they're having, not by their size of the organization. I think that's another important reason, because managers are often the decision makers here in these cases, right? And if they don't have the right incentives, they may be making decisions that are going against the interest of the larger organization. All right. Another one that I see very often is sort of like part of the discussion around security and velocity. A lot of the security investments, once they have matured to a certain degree, like let's take static analysis, for example, there's this notion like, okay, let's start shifting left. Right? Like you got your basic rule setups, you have processes to evolve these rules now. Why wouldn't you expose findings to your developers earlier? And I think we all agree, like, it's a great idea. It makes things smoother, and also it contributes to security. Like, for example, if you find issues earlier, I mean, most of the argument is cost, but like you can argue these issues get fixed more likely, and if they get fixed more likely, they're less likely to hit production. So there's a security argument here. But there is a lot of velocity value, a lot of cost saving here. And the cost saving is actually not on the security side, right? So in these cases where you're shifting left, what you're really doing is you're investing a lot in your security organization to provide these services to the developers that you're supporting, and they benefit from the velocity. Like you just, at the beginning, you have more work. Yeah, you're doing the right work, you're doing the right thing, but you have more work overall, and that is work that can potentially invest it in your security. So now, what I recommend in these cases, talk to the developers and use this as a check-in point to ask for funding. Like, make it explicit before you start larger shift left initiatives, and explain to them what is the value. Maybe you have enough data about vulnerabilities and how much time developers spend that you can actually put a number on this, and ask them to contribute funding. Maybe they can fund 50% of the initiative. But sometimes as good as we want to be as security practitioners and provide a great service to our organizations, I believe that oftentimes we just fall into the fallacy of doing this work under the hood and trading it for potential like direct security impact work, and never like losing the opportunity to have this conversation and get more funding with the developers that we support. Last but not least, this is more like a general idea of like how to fund your organization. It's the idea is like scale your security automatically. So we're not in that economic mode right now, but generally, like we've seen a lot of aggressive hiring, and even sometimes today, if you're in a software company, for example, chances are they're still building new organizations. Let's say in the AI space is like very popular today. So sometimes you do have aggressive growth in like certain areas, and the question is like, how do you support that? what I'm recommending is like have a conversation with your management chain and get to a certain like key ratio. Like for example, for mid-size and large companies, what I've seen go really well is like 2% security to engineering, for example, if we're talking about the product security or application security space. For smaller companies, my recommendation is like at least one engineer per program, and then multiple engineers sort of like they can share programs, so you have coverage for out of office and all this stuff. But later on, as you grow, there's like 2% rule. Usually I've seen it work out really well. A really like counterexample to this, something that I've seen as an anti-pattern is situations in which you individually go to your management chain for funding, and this often results in a situation where you only get net new work funded. And so, like for example, like if you only get net new work funded, then the problem is, first of all, you're providing incentives for shiny new projects to be proposed without really investing into the scale of your security fundamentals and hygiene. But also, like as your organization grows, so grow the number of programs based on the funding, and then you actually end up wasting a lot of resources in the case where each individual programs can't give you the coverage you need, and so you may end up getting hacked in a stupid way, which is what I believe happens a lot in the industry, and is the reason why why we haven't seen a lot of progress overall with protecting organizations. Well, those were the examples that I had. I would like to move forward here with questions, if there are any. Today we've talked about how to build effective security program on a tight budget. We talked about security maturity models that we can use to be smarter about allocating our resources. And we talked about specific strategies on how to obtain more funding and have these explicit checking points. Thank you so much.
That was amazing. We have some questions for you, sir. The first question, on the topic of build versus buy, what's your experience with open source versus paid tools with implicit requirement for more ops effort, or OSS?
I mean, personally, the advantage in open source, right? Like oftentimes is like, basically it's, comes for free if you don't have a company supporting it, right? If you do have a company supporting it, then, probably it doesn't count as open source for that matter. I personally believe there is a lot of value in many cases on like getting the explicit support and having some sort of an assured path of product and service development going forward. I can see cases where that may be less valuable. Like let's say you're trying to buy a specific security control and you're trying to get to security resilience and you're just looking at that technology. Open source can save you some money here for sure, but I would first look at am I effectively solving the problem, and does solving the problem require getting a service, right? What's the value of the service that I'm getting versus the money that I'm spending? So I would not generally, say one is better than the other. I would say it's really depends on doing a proper problem evaluation, which is one of the reasons why I believe this should be part of becoming a senior security engineer or even staff security engineer, because those are some of the important questions that I expect security practitioners to ask themselves when making these decisions.
Very well said. Okay, how do you assess a migration from a custom-built solution due to lack of a product to a vendor-provided solution?
Can you repeat the first part? Oh, I see. Yeah. So I would honestly treat it as a vendor evaluation. Whatever you have today, what is the service, what is the technology? You can look at this similar way as you look at a new vendor, right? And important is to not go with the sunk cost fallacy, right? A lot of times, part of the equation will be, we've already invested so much time into this, and this is the pure definition of sunk cost fallacy. So my recommendation is make the assumption you do not have anything today, and what option A is you're building out, or you're using what you already have today as a vendor, and you basically say, you look at what is the support for this custom built solution today, what does it cost, what does it look like, and how does it evolve in the future, and you kind of compartmentalize that as vendor one, and then you look at vendor B, C, D, whatever you want to do, how many vendors you want to evaluate. I often go by the rule of three, but I think basically try to abstract the problem of already having a solution as if this is a vendor you're going with, and then if that vendor wins, you're going to stick with the custom solution. If the vendor loses, you're going to get rid of your custom solution.
What kind of roles do you compare in the 2% rule?
What kind of roles I'm comparing? So that was mostly for security supporting engineering. I've seen this apply to larger security organizations as well. I think if I've seen the 2% of security practitioners in an organization they support. For example, if you're looking at the entire security organization, then you're looking at the entire rest of the company, if that's what you're supporting. If you're looking at product security, for example, you're looking at the product folks that they're supporting. I've seen the 2% rule relatively work in almost any scope. I've also seen this work relatively well for corporate security, for example. Usually what you do is you look at IT. Obviously, there are exceptions, right? Sometimes, what matters here is how the responsibilities are distributed, right? For example, if you have a very small IT team, then the 2% rule may actually not match up. So you may want to look at who truly has these IT responsibilities beyond IT. Highly likely that you have such a case if it's a very small IT team. But basically look at where do the responsibilities lie, and what are your teams supporting, and then look at if the 2% rule matches up to that.
Final question. What criteria would a company need to meet to consider staffing an internal red team instead of using consultants?
No, it's a really good question. There's a lot of really good questions here. Yeah, I love it. My personal experience is bug bounty programs do a pretty good job finding a lot of the low-hanging fruit product vulnerabilities. I personally believe that funding a red team, you really do that if bug bounty programs, even assuming you get really good engagement on the bug bounty program, of course, right? Because otherwise you can drive maturity there. Once you have done that, and you believe you need to test out your security resilience, that's what I would expect from an internal red team, essentially, right? It's if they're only giving me as good of an output as a bug bounty program, then I would not, the investment doesn't make sense. Because bug bounty programs, if you manage them well, they can, you can build community, and you can get very, very good engagement. So my bar for building a red team here is basically a lot higher. What I would want to see is probably going into the area of testing novel attacks. And if there's a need for that in my security model, if I make an explicit decision that the security maturity should go into this area, and I want to test my security resilience, that's when I would start looking at a security red team. And before that, probably consider contracting it out if there's individual needs. Sometimes you even need it for compliance, for example, right? But those are different pen tests. I consider pen tests here as truly, tell me something that I truly didn't know about the security of my organization.
Mr. Matenaar, that was truly insightful. Everybody give him a round of applause. He deserved that. Thank you so much for coming to BSides and presenting for us. That's a little gift for you from one of our sponsors. Actually, Socket Security is the one who is giving all the gifts this year, so we greatly appreciate them. And we couldn't do this without all of you, our volunteers, and of course, our sponsors. Again, there was some questions that were not able to get to. Mr. Matenaar, is going to be up in City View to answer any additional questions that you may have. So feel free to reach out to him there, and also get linked up with him and connect. We have a couple quick announcements. We have headshots all day today, right outside of the talk tracks. Go get a new headshot for your LinkedIn. And also, did you know we have a prayer and mother's room? Please stop by the info desk and we can help you find that if you would like. So thank you all for coming to B-Sides 2024 San Francisco, and we look forward to seeing you all next year.